Now choose, flee, or step forth. Take hold of what lies beyond. Claim mastery over the eternal ring.
As far as underrated games go, I can think of no game I love more that I wish other people would experience than Dragon's Dogma. I have been a huge fan of the Resident Evil series for years, ever since I was a child watching my mother attempt to escape Raccoon City. And while the action era of RE wasn't to everyone's taste, I still had plenty of fun playing those games. So when word got around that this new game I had never heard of called Dragon's Dogma would feature a playable demo for the then upcoming Resident Evil 6, I was totally on board to get my hands on that demo. Suffice it to say, however, Dragon's Dogma was a far better game than Resident Evil 6.
What's the matter? Not a fan of sewers?
Upon my initial playthrough of the game, a lot of aspects of the game didn't really strike me as much as they do today. Back then, I was still in high school and was just focused on having fun, to which I did, but as the years passed and I grew older, my subsequent playthroughs of Dragon's Dogma really made me appreciate all the mechanics the game implemented. The story, which had gone completely over my head when I was younger, now stood out as extremely poignant and tragic. Dragon's Dogma is not perfect, but it introduces some innovative features and dynamic combat that, with some refinement, could become even more spectacular. So, what exactly makes Dragon's Dogma so special? And is there enough raw potential still left untouched to possibly shape a fantastic sequel? By far, the most unique and impressive feature in Dragon's Dogma has to be the pawn system. Within the first few quests of the game, you would have unlocked the ability to summon forth your own personal pawn. You'll be able to customize not only their appearance, but also their vocation skills and equipment, and even their personality. It is surely a good thing too, because this pawn will be your most loyal companion and will pretty much accompany you through the entire game. But what manages to make the pawn system so much more special is that as the Arisen, you can have 3 pawns traveling with you at any time. Alongside you and your own pawn, you can hire pawns from beyond the rift from other worlds. In other words, so long as you're playing online, you can find and hire other players' pawns. So while this game is still a single player experience, it allows a sort of connectivity that plays well into the lore of the game's world. Some may just write this off as a gimmick, but in my opinion it is an incredibly genius system that manages to lay a solid foundation to be built upon, yet has so much untapped potential. After being granted the ability to call forth your own pawn, you'll be able to customize their appearance using the same customization options you were able to use to create your own character, with the biggest difference being that upon finalizing your pawn's appearance, you'll be asked some cryptic questions that'll ultimately decide your pawn's starting inclinations. More on that later. You'll then be able to choose which basic vocation your pawn will start off as, and just like that, you'll have your own pawn to freely shape, and you'll also now have full access to other players' pawns, assuming you're playing online. Likewise, your pawn will be available for other players to hire in their games, and when this happens, your pawn can actually gain some helpful rewards. While your pawn cannot gain EXP or level up when traveling with other Arisen in their games, your pawn will instead obtain Rift Crystals, which can be used to hire pawns that are stronger than you, purchase various vanity items, and also purchase the much needed items to help influence your pawn's inclinations. Again, more on those later. Your pawn will also be able to obtain enemy and quest knowledge. When looking at a pawn's stat page, you'll be able to learn just how much experience they have fighting various enemies that you'll encounter on your journey. The more knowledge they have, the smarter they'll be at effectively combating them. For a mage, this knowledge can be helpful in having them buff the party with the most effective element, for example. When fighting enemies that even you as the player have not yet encountered, pawns will often call out helpful tactics for dealing with enemies. Pawns will also be able to gain quest knowledge if they complete a quest with another Arisen that you have yet to do. With quest knowledge, they'll be able to give you helpful hints on where to proceed or whom to speak with. And these are all fantastic systems on paper, however, there is just sort of a nagging feeling that these aren't nearly as impactful or useful as they possibly could be. A lot of this could stem from the fact that I've played this game dozens of times at this point, and all of these hints are pretty much common knowledge for me, and I imagine for a newer player this sort of information would prove more useful. Although, considering how much you can effectively combat most enemies in the first half of the game with any sort of tactics you'd like, and considering the lack of more complex quests, many of these tips aren't really necessary, and it is truly a shame. The concept of having your companion travel between worlds and gaining experience from other players to help you on your journey is a fantastic one, and I'd love to see it implemented more thoughtfully in a theoretical sequel. But while we're on the topic of flawed systems, we have to discuss pawn inclinations. So, just what are inclinations? Because as far as I know, the game doesn't waste any time actually explaining to the player what inclinations actually are. You may recall that when you went to create your own pawn, you were asked a handful of very cryptic questions, and it is actually how you answer these questions that decide your pawn's starting inclinations. As far as the mechanical introductions go, this is definitely not how you get newer players to understand your systems. Your pawn's inclinations are essentially what determine how they behave in battle and while exploring. On your pawn's status menu, you'll be able to view what their primary and secondary inclinations are, but it is worth noting that your pawn's tertiary inclinations does seem to have some effect on them, if nothing else being able to creep up and take the secondary slot more easily, and also being outright selected as a secondary inclination with the use of the knowledge chair. More on that later. As we discussed before, your pawn's starting inclinations are determined when you create them, but these inclinations can and will be altered as you play through the game. A pawn's inclinations can shift depending on the types of enemies you fight, any actions you or your pawn may perform during a fight, while responding to the basic commands you can give your own pawns, and your pawn's inclinations can even be influenced by the other pawns you may hire through the rift. On paper, having your pawn's behavior shaped to how you perform and what decisions you make in battle sounds very interesting. However, in practice, it becomes a constant struggle to maintain your favorable inclinations and to keep less desirable inclinations in check so as to not be caught exploring in the field with no way to shift your pawn's inclinations back to how you prefer. The dreaded Acquisitor immediately comes to mind as a particularly annoying inclination that almost always ends up creeping up in the early game especially, making your pawn prioritize item acquisition over fighting engaged enemies. Consequently, with how little inclinations are explained to new players, you'll find many pawns in the rift with Acquisitor locked strongly into the primary or secondary slot. I should mention that, thankfully, having your pawn hired by other players cannot shift your pawn's inclinations at all. Likewise, the inclinations your hired pawns come with is what you'll have until you decide to part ways with them. Now, there are ways to control your pawn's inclinations. After progressing far enough in the main story, you'll be able to journey back to the encampment to find the NPC Jonathan near the Riftstone, and he'll sell you inclination elixirs to boost the inclinations of your choice. Unfortunately, these elixirs can only be purchased with Rift Crystals, which in the early game are pretty difficult to come by, and can become even harder still depending on just how many players are playing the game and actively hiring other pawns at any given time. Thankfully, with the Dark Arisen version of the game, which is the version most players will likely purchase at this point, you'll be able to find some side quests that will reward some Rift Crystals, and later on in the expansion area, you'll find that Rift Crystals drop more steadily. Upon boosting inclinations on your pawn via elixirs, you'll find that you may be able to choose the order in which your secondary and tertiary inclinations are prioritized using the knowledge chair. And here comes yet another feature that is, to my knowledge, never given a proper mention or introduction by the game itself. To the game's credit, knowledge chairs are scattered around everywhere in many inns and camps, so even if it takes a while, it's very likely that most players will eventually stumble upon and discover its utility during their adventure. As for what the knowledge chair does, as mentioned, you'll be able to decide between the two closest inclinations which one your pawn accepts as their secondary. At the knowledge chair, you'll also be able to select your pawn's speech behavior and their personalities and what they'll say in certain situations. Some examples being phrases they'll say upon a battle victory, or perhaps what they'll say upon taking critical damage, or how they'll respond to being revived by the Arisen. However, the method and how you're able to choose your pawn's personality is done in the most annoying and puzzling way. You would suspect that sitting in the knowledge chair would simply list every available speech option pawns have access to, along with each personality that they can adopt until you've selected every one, and can leave satisfied knowing that you flavored your pawn to your liking. Except, that's not how it's done at all. Instead, upon sitting in the knowledge chair, you'll be randomly given a handful of speech prompts that will be given 4 personalities to choose from, of which there are 7 total. And so, you'll oftentimes end up needing to sit in the knowledge chair dozens of times to not only get every speech prompt available, of which there are 9, but you'll also need to hope that when a speech prompt that you have not set also spawns the desired personality that you would like to select. Otherwise, You'll just have to keep rolling the prompts at the knowledge chair for even longer. This is baffling to me that someone at Capcom decided that this was how this feature was going to be implemented into the game. Like, why is it random chance that prompts are just asked at random, and why isn't every personality available to choose from each time? You wouldn't expect to open the settings menu in a video game and expect to only see some of the options each time and have to close and reopen the menu over and over again until you can finally see the settings that you want to change appear. That's just not how you implement a feature like this, and I don't understand how this was the way the developers chose to do this. But it is how it is, and I guess you're just gonna have to sit in that chair dozens of times. And one last feature relating to pawns that we can discuss is the process of hiring and dismissing pawns via the Rift. As mentioned, if you're playing online, you'll be able to access Rift Stones around the world and hire other players' pawns. So long as they are your level or lower, it won't cost anything, but hiring pawns higher level than you will cost you Rift Crystals. Also, if you're choosing to hire the pawn of a person on your friends list, it'll be completely free regardless if they are massively higher level than you. Although I feel like I should also mention that the amount of EXP that you and your pawn gain is tied to the level and presence of the other pawns you hire. Should you decide to travel with pawns lower level than you, you'll actually receive more EXP, and vice versa should you decide to travel with one much stronger than you. You could also, in fact, opt to travel with no hired pawns, or even completely alone, if you wanted to, and even gain more EXP for yourself, but that's an entirely different topic. Anyways, here in the Rift, you can sort pawns with a handful of different filters, and you'll be able to see their vocations, skills, augments, inclinations, and lots of other information. There's even a favorite feature so that you can repeatedly hire the pawns you really like, and on the flip side, dismissing a pawn has a couple extra features tied to it. Upon dismissal, you'll be able to select an item to gift to the pawn that they'll be able to bring back to their own Arisen. There are some pretty powerful items that you can actually hand over here, and you can really aid another player with some valuable items if you choose to. You can even gift various pieces of equipment to another Arisen by equipping it directly to their pawn, although there are obviously some restrictions on this, as you can't just trade the best gear in the game to a low level pawn, but you can still give some very strong equipment nonetheless. Furthermore, after you've chosen an item to gift, you'll be able to assign a rating to the pawn you've hired with 3 categories: appearance, battle, and helpfulness. These categories are honestly so broad that they're fairly meaningless. Not to mention that should a pawn perish without being properly dismissed at a Riftstone, they'll return to their Arisen with an average rating and everything, skewing the ratings completely anyway. Still, I have to say, for all its flaws, the pawn system is an incredibly engaging mechanic that allows player cooperation without explicitly making the game multiplayer. And thank goodness for that, honestly. In an age in gaming where seemingly every game needs to have multiplayer, it's refreshing to go back to a single player game that maintains that solo experience, while also still offering some neat ways to interact with other players playing the game alongside you at the time. Trading is possible, and even with the restrictions in place, there are still some downright ridiculously powerful things you can get early on in your game via trading that can completely tip the balance of the game in your favor. And it's just nice to see the world populated with pawns that other players have made. And that's just another thing too, that's just genius. Because pawns are implemented into the lore of the world, they can actually act as NPCs in another player's game and help populate areas and cities for the developers. I mean, it's just a fantastic idea. With more depth given to dialogue with your pawns and just more time and thought poured into the various systems and features of the pawns in general, you could really make something even more special, and I hope they really do get a chance to do that in a sequel. Pawns are a great and simple innovation. AI-controlled party members that can travel across worlds to help other players. But what about the combat? Let's first begin by discussing vocations, or your character's class if we're using more general terms. Before you even begin a battle, you'd need to decide which vocation you'd like to be. There are 9 total vocations available, each managing to maintain their own specific strengths to make even the basic starting vocations still viable in the late game. There are a handful of weapon types that can only be equipped by certain vocations, and each possess some basic attacks and combos that you can unlock to use. But more interestingly, each vocation allows access to certain skills, of which you can equip 3 for each weapon type, or 6 spells total in the case of Mage and Sorcerer. Each vocation has their own styles of playing that are fun, fluid, and intuitive for the most part. There is a basic level that you can play each vocation at, and you'll usually be able to get by with just that basic knowledge, but there are still some real interesting things and combinations of skills that you can do with some of the vocations that can really elevate your effectiveness. There are 9 total vocations for you to choose from, although pawns aren't allowed to be assigned any hybrid vocations, so for them they really only have access to 6. But still, there's enough variety here that you can really experiment and have fun before settling down with whatever vocation suits you. However, that of course does bring us to the leveling up and stat distribution dilemma. When you level up, your stats are automatically distributed depending on which vocation you have equipped at the time. Therefore, there are some people out there who will make certain builds to really get the most out of their levels and stats, but honestly I'd say that it doesn't really matter too much, and your equipment will usually have the biggest impact when challenging the tougher encounters in the game, so unless you're really committed, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Now, despite the vocations on offer, eventually, with how much combat you'll be engaging in and the limited amount of skills that you can have equipped at a time, it is inevitable that combat would begin to feel stale after enough hours spent fighting. Thankfully, there are several other pillars that keep battles engaging even once you've settled into your favorite vocations and skills. The enemy design and AI. It's not perfect, but there's enough there to really make you engage different types of enemies in different ways, and to force you to mix up your tactics depending on what it is you're actually facing, which is more than enough for me in an action RPG. For example, wolves. You'll fight wolves a lot in the early game, and as you progress further, you'll find more vicious and powerful types of wolves that'll evolve their tactics. When you fight wolves, you'll learn very early on that they always hunt and attack in packs. You'll never just find a single wolf all on its own, so you'll have to face a whole pack at once. They're usually spread out to surround your party. When you attempt to engage them in close melee combat, they'll usually backpedal to avoid your attacks, and will usually counterattack when they find an opening in your assault. If a wolf's attacks should be enough to knock you to the ground, they'll sometimes follow up by biting and gnawing at you until you manage to shake them off, or one of your pawns intervenes. Some of the smarter types of wolves may even first grab you and drag you away from your allies before attacking you further away, making it more difficult for your allies to save you. I mean, come on, compare and contrast with another certain game that everyone seems to cherish. And I mean, these are just wolves, right? Imagine all the other types of enemies you'll fight, and all the little mechanics that they have to make them tick, and all the different tactics you'll have to use to defeat them. Harpies will often fly around overhead in circles, making them very difficult to hit with attacks, all while singing to lull your party to sleep so they can attack with no resistance. Goblins will attempt to throw things like oil and poisons, and will sometimes blind you. If left alone for too long, some goblins will even blow horns and call more reinforcements to come and attack you. The ways enemies fight and how you fight them is extremely important in keeping action and combat engaging. To help illustrate my point, you need not look any further than to just see how your attacks actually make impacts on your enemies. Pelt a smaller enemy with enough blows and you'll actually be able to knock them off balance. The use of heavier weapons, such as the ones wielded by the warrior vocation, can easily disrupt enemy positions, and the use of certain skills can also help facilitate enemies being knocked around. Each enemy type is also given specific weaknesses and weak points that your party should strive to take advantage of. Attack a Cyclops in the eye, and you'll see it grip its head in agony and writhe about wildly. Severing the tails off Saurians will disable their attacks and may even cause them to scurry away in fear. Throughout your adventure, you'll face many enemies many times larger than the human-sized Arisen, and while ranged weaponry and magic can be certainly used to target enemy weaknesses, those who prefer a more personal approach still have ways of reaching those trickier places. The ability to mount and climb enemies adds a huge dynamic to combat. Not only does this manage to make encounters with larger enemies more engaging, but it adds a lot of epic flair to one's immersion. Armed with the ability to climb onto enemies, the developers are able to get far more creative with their enemy designs. Now, not only can weak points be placed pretty much anywhere with the expectation of the player to climb to reach it, they can also design enemy AI to also respond to being climbed upon. Climbing the Cyclops' back may cause it to reach around and grab you if you're not wary. Clinging onto an ogre may cause it to leap and land on its back, crushing you in the process. And attempting to scale any flying creature will usually cause it to take flight and attempt to shake you off, and without the precautions to secure the enemy on the ground, you'll have to deal with the consequences of gravity. Targeting weak points is all good and fun, but there is another layer to combat still with the introduction of magic. Vocations that specialize in magic are inherently pretty interesting and engaging because of the design decision to have magic be so impactful. Even if you should pick to play a vocation that doesn't use any magic yourself, a mage or sorcerer can be equipped to imbue the party's weapons with various elements available in the game, ranging from fire, ice, lightning, darkness, and holy. And as you'd expect, each enemy has a varying resistance to each type of magic, but beyond that, each element itself has different bonus effects when applied in combat. Fire will burn, ice will freeze, lightning can arc to nearby enemies, holy will actually heal you when striking enemies, and darkness... I actually don't know what darkness does, but the wiki here says that darkness has increased critical hit rate, so I'll take the word for it. Magic can be particularly devastating if allowed to be casted. Sorcerers in particular can equip some of the most powerful attacks in the game utilizing the elements, at the price of having to stand very nearly still and incant them for quite a long while. But should a sorcerer be allowed to actually get their cast off, you'll be able to behold the spectacle that is their magic attacks. Magic is very satisfying to use, even at a base level. Fire is something that remains an exceptional choice for the early to mid game, and even just seeing the effects of having your melee weapons imbued with fire can be a lot of fun. Sear the wings of harpies to prevent them from flying, or set fire to a goblin to see them screaming and running around, or watch a wolf on fire smartly roll around in place to snuff the flames. All of these aspects of vocation and enemy design, and the inclusion of mounting and climbing, the personality and impact of skills, and how magic can be applied to battle help to keep the combat engaging. And it is certainly a good thing too, for what better way is there to prepare to slay the dragon than by slaying all types of other monsters as well. And now I would like to discuss a fairly underrated feature. Easily one of the best feelings that Dragon's Dogma manages to invoke is the feeling of adventure. And sure, many games will allow you to arm yourself with weapons, strap on armor, and give you plenty of reasons to venture out into the vast world provided for you, but very, very little manage to make it feel like an adventure. An expedition. You of course would be advised to arm yourself with the best arms and armor you can afford, but beyond that, it is also a good idea to ensure that you have enough curages to heal any nasty debilitations, as well as potions, herbs, and food to restore health and stamina. Lanterns to illuminate the night and caverns, as well as any other key items you may be charged with carrying. When venturing into the depths of some of the more difficult areas in the later parts of the game, not having sufficient supplies to maintain the health of your party can mean losing a pawn or two in your expedition, and facing some of the greater beasts lurking in the dark with the party not at full strength can lead to some catastrophic results. Thankfully, it's not just yourself who's responsible for looking around all of these provisions. It is a team effort, and as you'd expect, each party member has their own weight to carry. Now, here's a mechanic that's relatively small in the grand scope of things, but one that I appreciate nonetheless. Carry capacity. Most games tend to adopt one of two systems, either by giving you a finite amount of space that you can use to carry your items, or by enforcing a certain weight threshold that you should try not to exceed, else your movement be significantly hampered. It is fairly unrealistic and non-committal to adopt the second method in my opinion. It doesn't make much sense that you can stuff your pockets with so much loot and move around normally, only to find yourself suddenly moving at a snail's pace upon exceeding your carry capacity by picking up a single item. And most of the time, so long as you are nowhere near this cap in capacity, you won't even be considering the weight of the items you pick up until you eventually inch closer to that breaking point. Dragon's Dogma manages to take that concept and add just enough complexity to make the mechanic interesting. Each character's carry capacity is split into different tiers. Depending on how much one character is carrying will also determine how quickly they can move. And another little detail that I love is that the exact placement of each weight tier is actually determined by the build and weight of your character. Naturally, being agile is preferred, and so to maintain a lower weight tier, you want to constantly be splitting your items that you pick up along your journey with your entire party. This does involve a lot of interacting with your inventory menus, which some may complain breaks up the pace of the game too much. For myself personally, I love the interactions as it feels more like an expedition. While there are no survival mechanics implemented into the game such as the need to eat or sleep, one could theoretically stay out in the field exploring for as long as they please, save for the fact that they will eventually have their entire inventories filled so that they will be traveling much slower. And you'd be encouraged to pick up plenty of items along your journey. You'll find many helpful herbs, fruits, and vegetables out in the wilderness, and you'll also be able to find potions and curatives scattered about in crates and chests. Monsters all have specific items that can only be obtained by slaying them, and you can also mine ore or capture fish in bodies of water. There are plenty of items worth obtaining in the game, as there are plenty of ways of using each item. You can expect many curatives, even basic ones, to be able to be combined to create stronger medicines. Items in monster drops can be used to upgrade various pieces of equipment or can be combined into bombs or other useful items. I'm sure that in the grand scheme of things, not every single item has a decent purpose, but I find myself willingly looting most things I can find and storing them away on the off chance that I can combine them into something that I may need later on. And that is something I must commend. In a game that has as many different items as there are, it's important to have systems in place that can keep many of those items useful without overcomplicating the game with complex systems. Either you use the items, you combine them, or you use them to upgrade your gear. It's that simple, and yet more than enough to keep me hoarding everything I can see. And with all this talk of adventuring, just how large is the world of Dragon's Dogma? The size of the world map in Dragon's Dogma is fairly modest compared to other open world RPGs. Not as large and sprawling as ones you'd expect to find in Bethesda's RPGs, but it manages to make do with its size by having familiarity on its side. You'll find yourself traversing the same roads to get to several different destinations, and each place you'll find seems to be implemented with much more care than a simple copy and paste job, although in the late game you'll be sure to find certain dungeons that do indeed make use of the same rooms and chambers. Still, when it comes to the open world exploration, there's just enough there to keep the game interesting for your playthrough, although there is the sense that the world does feel a little small for the grand plot that the narrative attempts to tell, which, speaking of, we should get to soon enough. But before that, there's one thing I want to discuss. The gameplay you're seeing is from the Steam port of Dragon's Dogma, Dark Arisen. About a year after the original game's release, Dragon's Dogma received an expansion in the form of Dark Arisen. This version adds a new endgame area to explore along with new enemies, loot, and challenges to go with it, but it does also alter some things in the original game. Most of these changes are fairly small tweaks, but among the bigger changes were the addition of more port crystals and the Eternal Fairy Stone. Port crystals are locations that can be traveled to instantly with the use of a fairy stone. In the original game, port crystals were exceedingly rare. There was only one port crystal located in Grand Soren, as far as I can remember, and you could only obtain one portable port crystal in your first playthrough of the game, with them being purchasable only in New Game Plus. Furthermore, fairy stones were a lot less common, and obviously the Eternal Fairy Stone did not exist, making teleports a luxury that you could only partake in very occasionally. This made journeys much more fulfilling as you not only had to travel to where you wanted to go, but eventually had to make it back to a city to rest and unload your items, or at the very least make use of the handful of camps placed around the world to send items back to storage. In Dark Arisen, port crystals were increased dramatically. A permanent crystal was now located outside Khazardus as well as in Bitterblack Isle, and you could now find 4 more portable port crystals in key locations on your first playthrough. Furthermore, if you owned a copy of the original Dragon's Dogma, you could import that save to receive the Eternal Fairy Stone, which, as you would guess, does not get consumed on use. But even if you didn't, fairy stones became far more common and cheaper too, I believe. Although nowadays, the more recent ports of Dark Arisen to Steam, PS4, Switch, and Xbox One now just give you the Eternal Fairy Stone outright, making normal fairy stones pretty much obsolete. And really, this does kinda rob a lot of the magic of the adventure feel of the mid-game, in my opinion. I mean, yes, early on, before you've established your network of crystals, you'll still have to travel by foot, but eventually you'll find yourself mindlessly teleporting to where you need to be all the time, and it's kind of a shame. Of course, you can still make the conscious decision not to use the Eternal Fairy Stones and port crystals, but I'm sure most players would rather choose convenience over immersion. Of course, every adventure needs a compelling tale. So who exactly is the Arisen? For what reason does the dragon attack? And what is the secret that governs the world? You are an unnamed resident of a small fishing village that is attacked by the dragon. As chaos ensues and people are being slaughtered, you take up arms in an attempt to fight the beast, only for you to predictably stand no chance. Defeated, the dragon spares your life and instead takes a different prize, in the form of your beating heart. Your wound closes, leaving a massive scar across your chest and marking you as an Arisen. From this point on, you set off on a journey to find the strength and titles necessary to battle the dragon and possibly reclaim your heart and save the land. There is a lot to enjoy about Dragon's Dogma's story. However, as much as I adore this game, even I have to admit that the story is told kinda poorly. When given all the information and lore needed to piece together a narrative in your mind, Dragon's Dogma manages to form a very interesting and tragic tale. However, this requires exploring much of the game's offerings, speaking and going through many pieces of optional dialogue, and ensuring not to miss key side quests that provide necessary insight to understanding parts of the game's intended ending. If one were to miss some of this content and take the main quest at face value, they'd be faced with lengthy bouts of adversaries spotting long strings of exposition that seemingly comes abruptly and is likely not to keep the player invested or engaged. It really is a shame, then, that I cannot argue with some people who find the story lacking. One of the game's greatest flaws must be how it handles the telling of elements of its story and lore, and how much potential key characters could have but is ultimately ignored in favor of more inconsequential tasks. Still, even taking into account how mixed I feel about the story aspect of the game, it is still worth playing. If you've made it this far without having played the game for yourself, I hope I've managed to convince you that this is definitely something worth playing, and I'd encourage you to do so. For the rest of this review, I'm going to be discussing spoilers for the story, and while I did say that the way the story is told is not the best, I still think it's a compelling tale, and I think that it's something you should try to experience through the game for yourself. The Dark Arisen version of the game is thankfully available on just about any platform where you can find Skyrim, and dare I say is a far more compelling adventure. So pick it up, enjoy it for yourselves, and if you're still interested in what I have to say about the story, I'd be very happy if you came back to see what I think. And also, at the time of writing the script for this video, the Netflix anime based on the game has not yet been released, but you can be sure that a lot of revelations revealed here will almost certainly be in the story of the anime as well, so spoilers for that as well, probably. Let's first discuss the matter of quests. One of the biggest issues the story faces is the fact that a lot of the interesting and important information regarding the role of the Arisen that have come before you, the pawns, and the dragon are actually not learned via the main questline, but instead through side quests that can be easily missed if certain prerequisite side quests were not completed early in the game, or if you simply just progressed too far through the main questline. It truly feels like some of the main quests and side quests were flipped in terms of relevancy to the actual main story that should be being told. Many of the main quests are just busy work that you'd suspect would be side quest material. Hunt a griffin, track down a missing ring, retake a fort from goblins, gather evidence for a trial. Meanwhile, things like learning more about pawns and what it means for them to gain their own will, or learning about Arisen who have come before you, or finding the Arisen's bond are all relegated to easily missable side quests. It's extremely puzzling that this is how they decided to implement seemingly important information in quests relating to the main plot, and a large portion of the main quest can be summarized very curtly. And so, to make more inconsequential matters short, you eventually prove yourself a capable enough warrior to be granted an audience with the Duke who has bested a dragon before in the past. He grants you the power you need to reach everywhere in the land you may need to go, and permits you do whatever you can to aid in the slaying of the dragon. And so you spend many hours doing tasks for the Duke that have no real bearing on the main story, so let's just discuss things that I personally deem relevant. A constant plot that you'll actually find in and outside the main quest surrounds the cult Salvation. They are led by a mysterious man named Elysian, and their ideology seems to be the reveling in the appearance of the dragon, or at the least the chaos the dragon brings. You'll spend some time investigating the cult, and Elysian does play the part of a villain in the absence of the dragon for the better part of the game. Another main quest that you can complete that actually does have some meaning of import is one that introduces you to the Dragonforged and the Fool. The Dragonforged is an ancient Arisen who will offer you some guidance and answer some questions relating to the dragon and your quest to slay it, while the Fool is his pawn that has a striking resemblance to him. The Dragon Forged will not offer any great revelations as he deems you better to learn them when the time comes, but he will confirm that the Duke was indeed the Arisen who came before you, although that he does not quite know how he defeated the dragon in his time. Another early quest that you can take before you make it to Grand Soren sees you following your childhood friend into the Lost Woods. Together you seek out a witch who lives there, as Kina suspects that she may know of a cure to being stricken as the Arisen. In the woods you only find a young girl named Celine. She explains that her grandmother was likely the rumored witch, however she has long since passed away. You can return to the woods later on to find that some townspeople are attempting to hunt and kill Celine, believing that she has some relation to the dragon, but they are ultimately scared off by a golem meant to protect her. Venturing further into the woods you can find Celine, but also the ghost of Sophia. Sophia was an Arisen before you and has since passed. Celine was her pawn, and it is here that she explains the concept of bestowal of spirit. This is a phenomenon whereby pawns begin to take on the appearance of their masters over time, and also begin to gain a will of their own. At this point, Celine's pawn print fades as she becomes fully human, and her first decision she makes on her own is to stay where the Arisen's home is in Khazardus. Returning to this place later on, you'll find an ancient tablet that can be taken to the Dragonforged for more information. The Dragonforged explains that the tablet presents itself to each Arisen and will take a form that represents what each Arisen holds most dear to them. The tablet then becomes a ring named the Arisen's Bond, and the Dragonforged explains that this means that people are the thing that the Arisen holds most dear, and that whomever the Arisen gives this ring to will be strongly linked to them. Speaking of which, romance. The character the Arisen deems as their beloved has a big part to play in the battle against the dragon. While it is possible, perhaps chaotically so, for anyone with a high enough affection to become the Arisen's beloved, the game seems to strongly push the Duchess, Eleanor, into the role. Falling head over heels for the Arisen after one chance meeting, the Arisen can involve themselves further with Eleanor and catch a glimpse into the Duke's trauma, as he will, at one point, attempt to strangle Eleanor in a daze, shouting apologies to another woman. The Arisen can intervene, and despite the massive consequences one might expect to occur, no mention of this is made by the Duke after the Arisen's initial punishment. Perhaps this is due to a lack of implementation of additional dialogue, or perhaps the Duke is afraid of what may come to light should he draw too much attention to the matter. No matter, should you continue on to involve yourself with the Duchess, you will be tasked with rescuing her from the Duke so that she may safely return home. The Arisen will share a passionate kiss with her, implying that the Arisen too returns her feelings. It is also one final chance to offer the Arisen's bond to the Duchess, should the player choose. In truth, there are many the Arisen can offer the bond to, the implication being that whomever is gifted this ring will be selected as the Arisen's bond, or so it should be.
What an exquisite ring! Is this for me? Oh, I thank you, dear warrior. 'Tis truly a thing of beauty. I much prefer it to the bauble I received from the Duke.
After much meandering on the Duke's part, the dragon, presented as Grigori by Elysian, finally makes his reappearance to signal the coming climax of the game. After receiving orders from the Duke, it is now time for you to face the dragon. And so, you come face to face with Grigori and are offered a choice. The Arisen's beloved has been captured by the dragon. Perhaps this is the one chosen to carry the Arisen's bond. However, due to some complicated calculations, it can be deemed that another with high enough affections for the Arisen could be their beloved instead, even should the Arisen have gifted the bond to someone else. It is an odd design choice to present such an important item to deliberately help the player select who would be their beloved, yet for it not to be unquestionably certain is kinda disappointing. Nevertheless, the dragon offers you the choice to sacrifice your beloved, and in return, he will leave the land in peace for a time. He reveals that the Duke whose orders you've been following gained the supposed glory he obtained through that very bargain, and now that ultimatum is now yours. You can actually reach a bad ending here by taking this bargain, but obviously, you decide to face the dragon. A lengthy sequence ensues, filled with intense chase sequences and varied battle locations, some cinematic flair, all the while with Grigori urging you to slay him.
The hour for turning back is past. The world will have its answer. You or me, death or life. life beyond. If you would gain aught, give your all here and now. Such is the contest you have chosen.
Stop! No!
Hollow vessel in the form of man. Have you come so far to be stricken with cowardice, Arisen? You have chosen your path. There is naught beyond this moment for those who will not give themselves whole to their cause.
It is aloft!
If you are truly awakened unto the world, you shall weather the fires of perdition unscathed. Surpass me, if you would truly be the one to take up the endless chain.
No, Master! Aim for its heart! Quickly! The heart is unprotected! I sent you back to the grave! I've learned beasts.
Stubborn child. Whatever meaning life holds, it makes men deaf to all reason. Heed me well, Arisen. In my death, you've won a future for this world. But what that future spells for you, for all men, is a truth you'll find staring back from this world's utmost depth.
And upon his defeat, your heart is reclaimed. Every surviving Arisen who has come before you also receives their heart, and time catches up with them, turning the Dragon Forge to dust and the Duke very old and frail. The dragon offers one last bit of advice to push you closer to the truth of the world, and face the dust himself. The Arisen leaves victorious and shares a passionate night with their beloved, and make their way back to Kazadis as the credits play. However, the game is not quite over. The world has seemingly taken a turn for the worse. Ash seems to fall from the sky, and even more vicious beasts now roam the world. Upon returning to the Duke and Grand Soren, you find his old weak self, and he brands you a traitor, and doesn't believe that you've actually slain the dragon at all, and have instead decided to take his bargain like he did. The soldiers attack you, and as you are forced into the main square, you fall into a literal hole in the world that instead cycles you back into the sky, and you find yourself falling through the Everfall. This serves as the endgame dungeon of the base game, and upon accumulating enough wake stones, which are exceedingly common drops in this particular dungeon, you can then enter the final stage of the story and learn the real truth of the world. Upon leaping into the portal created by the wake stones you've collected, you can now face the Seneschal. The Seneschal wastes little time and provides you with a simple task: defeat him and take his place as the keeper of the world. As you face him, he elaborates and explains the truth that holds the world in place, the endless cycle that even he is slave to, for it is the will of the Seneschal that sustains the world, and eventually it will take its toll on him as his will is eventually drained. When this occurs, life will lose its luster, its volition. People created will now only be empty husks that yearn or desire for nothing. You are now reminded of the pawns, beings created by Arisen that have no will of their own, beings who will only follow the command of the Arisen, who are people chosen by the dragon for their outstanding courage and their will to survive. And now you see it, a brilliant test to prepare the Arisen for their final ultimate task. Just as your will can give purpose to pawns, so too will your will give the world and its inhabitants vibrant life and the wills to live and survive. The dragon, too, is a test, a tool of the endless cycle, a harbinger of destruction to create strife and conflict, to encourage those with the courage and will to survive to rise up against the dragon. Those whom the dragon deem worthy have their hearts stolen, their chests scarred, marked by the dragon and forced to become Arisen. Arisen are immortal and only able to be slain in battle. A safety measure, perhaps, to prevent frailty and weakness from having their will sufficiently meddled and tested. But should the Arisen fall in battle against another foe, then surely they would stand no chance against the dragon themselves. Against the fight with a seneschal, should you be slain, or more accurately, kill yourself seeing as you'll likely be far over-leveled and geared before you reach him, you will see for yourself how dragons are created. For dragons are fallen Arisen, an Arisen who had bested their dragon, but were still unable to face the might of the seneschal, and so they go forth into the world to find another who may yet slay them, someone who will be stronger, who can best the seneschal. After testing the Arisen's prowess in battle, it is now time to test the resolve. He will grant the Arisen one final choice. Turn back, ignore the truth, return to their peaceful lives, and grow old. The seneschal will create husks of characters you would have met along your journey. Some will attempt to persuade you with words to choose the path of ignorance, and some will also attempt to fight you, although their attacks are physically meaningless. Yet, should you persist, the seneschal will disrobe and reveal themselves to be Savin, the Arisen you played briefly in the prologue of the game.
今やお前は限りなく我に近づいている。さあ続けよう。かつての我が力を呼び戻し、各社にふさわしい戦いとしよう。ここが対の地だ。存分に震え。
He summons his pawn, as well as your own, and now, each of you supported by your most loyal companion, must face each other for the final battle. Upon besting Savin, he apologizes to you. Every trick he has used to persuade you to give up your conquest has yet been more tests. He then pulls the God's Bane from his chest and presents it to you. Only this blade can successfully kill the seneschal. He offers to answer any questions you may have before requesting that you relinquish him of his power and release him from the coil of the endless cycle. Upon his death, he is granted peace, and now you sit as seneschal of the world. At this point, you are allowed to visit Khazardus and Grand Soren, however only as an invisible and corporeal form. You cannot talk or interact with anyone else. Yet, as was pointed out to you prior when you received the Arisen's bond, what you as the Arisen value most is people. And yet, even as the most powerful being, a person who can literally create life and give those the will to live, you yourself cannot interact with any of it. Your only companion is your pawn, who quietly stands before you as you sit in your empty chamber, awaiting the next who would succeed you. The only way to truly end the game now is for you to draw the God's Bane and plunge it into your own chest. Upon your death, your pawn watches over your body until both of you fall into the world itself. Your pawn calls to you as you both fall into the water. Your pawn then awakens, however, their form now resembles yours. A person whom you share a close bond with will then approach your pawn, although this isn't necessarily your beloved. And then your pawn comes to the realization as to what has happened. The bestowal of spirit that the Arisen Sophia has spoken of seems to have occurred, and now your pawn has been granted a will of their own, and their own life to live. They would even seem to make one last nod of appreciation to your memory.
終わったのかな。よく分かってないんだけど、何かすごいことがあって、それで世界が変わった。まあなるようになったってことだと思うのよね。
You feel an odd pride as you plunge the God's Bane into your chest, as if claiming a great victory. Finally, there is an end for your tale, one penned by your own hand no less. As your consciousness fades into the black, you feel a peculiar sensation on your lips. You are smiling. Cleansed by the surf, a body washes ashore on a deserted beach. Nameless, this soul awakens, eyes gleaming with the will to live, and for all things worth living for. And so, with that is how Dragon's Dogma truly ends. It is rather tragic, isn't it? Despite overcoming every trial put before them, the Arisen's ultimate fate is to be almost cruelly forced into the position of seneschal of the world, providing their own will so that the world may develop life and will of its own. Fuel for the fire that will eventually drain and be spent until someone new comes along to fuel the fire next. Unable to stand the isolation of their position, the Arisen instead chooses a death by their own hand with the use of the God's Bane. This releases them from their position as the seneschal and allows them to die peacefully, and for their pawn to now inherit their features and a will of their own, to live a life, their own life, although perhaps not quite so, seeing as they do have some acquaintances the Arisen may have had, which may complicate things. Still, it is a bit of shining light, and a tragic end for the hero of the story. In the end, everyone, the Arisen, the dragon, the seneschal, the entire world is a slave bound to the endless cycle, an eternal ring of causation. The seneschal grants life and will to the inhabitants of the world. The dragon causes conflict and prompts the rising of Arisen to best and defeat them. Arisen who cannot best the seneschal are thrust back into the world as dragons to find more Arisen who are stronger, until eventually one with a strong enough will comes to relieve the seneschal, and the cycle continues over and over again. The Arisen may have freed themselves from the endless cycle, but it persists still. So many are still enthralled in that eternal ring. Many have come before, and many will come after. Some peace for the hero of the story, but to what end? There is the question of how the state of the world will be affected without a seneschal for the world to draw from, and presumably the next Arisen to best the dragon from another world beyond the rift will arrive to find an empty seat for them to take. There are many things of the story that are unclear or that can't be picked apart, but I think it still stands as a rather sad and compelling tale. I hope you can kind of see what I mean by Dragon's Dogma's story having some great potential, but if you played the game yourself, you know that it isn't very well structured or told in a very digestible manner to make it appealing to the average player. All in all, the story is what the story is. And personally, revisiting the story with a more mature mind has only made me adore it. I think it is a fascinating and tragic tale. There are characters I wish we'd have seen more of, and I wish the story and quests had been structured better, but overall, I can honestly say I love the story. As of the making of this video, the Netflix anime based on the game has yet to be released, but I do have high hopes for it. Something like an anime is perfect to allow the writers to tell Dragon's Dogma's story, without having the burden of things like quest design to get in the way, and I am very much looking forward to how it turns out. The anime even has David Lodge reprising his role as the dragon, which is just amazing. Speaking of which, the voices. How are they? Now, the original releases of Dark Arisen, that is to say, the versions that were released for PS3 and Xbox 360, allowed the option of choosing Japanese voices for the Western releases. Unfortunately, this option is not available for the more recent ports of Dark Arisen, but I was able to fairly quickly install a mod that added the Japanese voices into most of the game. I just personally prefer having Japanese voices in my JRPGs, and this game is no exception. I completed 3 separate playthroughs for this review, and one of them was with the English dub, and thankfully, my preferences aside, the English dub for this game is actually very good. As mentioned before, I think David Lodge's performance as the dragon is the standout role, but everyone does a fair job giving believable performances. Believe me, I've played my fair share of JRPGs with English dubbing, and a lot of them have some pretty obnoxious deliveries. Although one thing that will come up in any RPG where you'll spend countless hours playing is the repetition of lines. It is fairly inevitable, and it comes up a lot in pawn banter and chatter. I don't know if it's just because it sounds like it fits better because of all of my time watching anime, or because it's not my native language, but banter seems to work and not wear itself out as quickly when playing with Japanese voices. This was my impression too when playing through Final Fantasy 15, which has a similar party structure and tons of character banter. But again, I think this just has more to do with the fact that Japanese is a more foreign language to me than English. And while we're on that topic, I kinda just brought it up on a whim if I'm being honest, but now I'm reminded of it, I do want to mention Keiji Fujiwara. He voiced Arisen in the aforementioned Final Fantasy 15, and he also has a minor role as Baroque, who you meet in Bitterblack Isle. He has voiced many characters across games and anime, and unfortunately passed away earlier this year in April. He was a fantastic voice actor, and I just wanted to mention him briefly here because I think he was amazing. So, I did.
ここに来たやつの寿命の話さ。気にするな。何十人と見てきたが、予想が当たった試しがない。
One last criticism I have about the English cast is that there are some characters that maybe try a bit too hard with the accents that can give some shaky lines. Most notable, the English actors for Mercedes and Julian have some pretty heavy accents that don't always land for me.
Spare me your sophistry. The word neighbor sours on your forky tongue. Our lands have long sworn unstinting aid to any neighbor beset by the dragon.
Unstinting, you say? Tell me then, why has your Lord Father not sent your brother, joined by Hearthstone's finest steel? Why am I speaking instead with a bleating she-goat mocked even by her own men?
You will retract those words, sir!
Else suffer what consequence?
But overall, if you play this game with English voices, it isn't all that bad. In fact, it's actually pretty good. And I thoroughly enjoyed hearing David Lodge as the dragon in one of my more recent playthroughs.
The rantings of an up-jump zealot make for tedious listening. His ilk serves no role in what is to come. Only my death will staunch the flood of destruction, a task still far beyond your means. If you would face me, seek me out, and I shall allow it. But heed the zealot's lesson well, when the weak court death may find it.
Of course, it would be unforgivable to not mention Bitterblack Isle.
あなたはあなたの意志でその使命を受け入れたのですか？各社。そう、あなたは各社でしたね。ここは先ほどの浜から遠い沖にある島、国樹島。私はあなたに探索をお願いしたいのです。
The Dark Arisen expansion introduces a new endgame area known as Bitterblack Isle. There is a coldness here, a feeling of dread and unease grips the dark chambers and presents a foreboding atmosphere. Here, you'll face even more ferocious beasts, find even stronger weapons and armor, and will have more uses for your rift crystals. Most loot obtained in Bitterblack Isle must actually be purified with rift crystals before they can be revealed to be a number of things from a set loot table. To help facilitate their increased value, rift crystals are also common drops here, although the best way to obtain them is to still have your pawn hired by another Arisen. In Bitterblack Isle, you'll be able to uncover yet another extremely tragic story. An ancient Arisen named Gret and her pawn Orla take in a young boy named Ash. Gret mentors and raises Ash, but eventually has to face the dragon. Tragically, Gret fails against the final test against the Seneschal, and becomes a dragon herself unbeknownst to Ash. Orla returns alone, and Ash and Orla fall in love. Ash then vows vengeance against the dragon, not knowing that the dragon he faces now is actually Gret, the person who he pursues vengeance for. And so, upon facing Gret, he is given the impossible choice: sacrifice his beloved Orla, or face and kill his mentor Gret. Unable to decide, Ash curses the endless cycle, but in return, Orla is slain and Ash is cursed, and the Bitterblack Isle you now explore is the land that has been twisted and warped by his madness and grief.
お前の大切なものを差し出して願いを叶える。
選ぶ。俺が選ぶ。倒す。差し出す。選べるわけがない。どうしてこんな攻めくを俺にや最後の助けるチャンスに愛しているのはどっちだ。あなたが俺が神の導きだ。神を壊す。全て壊す。
そう、それがお前の望みか。ならば差し出せ。
やめろ。やめてくれ。
As if the main story wasn't sad enough, here is yet another tragic tale to ponder and contemplate. The story of Dark Arisen is unraveled in a much better way than the main story in my opinion. Considering that Bitterblack Isle is mostly contained, it can unfold its story quite well without having to focus on other aspects of the game, like the main questline was responsible for setting up. The story of Dark Arisen is mostly told via voices you'll hear while exploring deeper into the depths of Bitterblack Isle, and also by receiving recollections of key characters like Orla, Gret, and Ash. As for the challenges you'll face on the Isle, it's mostly fun. You'll face bigger, badder enemies here. The powerful gear you'll be able to obtain is a plus, but the grind can be dreadfully RNG ridden. After defeating the main boss of Bitterblack Isle, the chambers will actually shift. Stronger enemies will now roam the depths, as well as chances at better loot. But sometimes the challenge of this post-cleared Bitterblack Isle is really just nonsense. A score of strong enemies thrown into a room with no real consideration given to the balance of the encounter, that it just becomes frustrating rather than an engaging challenge. As you'd expect, most people looking to farm loot will likely run past most rooms to just get to the chests and boss fight that have the best chances at the best rewards. Still, Bitterblack Isle is a fun addition to people who enjoyed the base game, and it's worth at least doing once for the story alone. Pawns created by the player able to traverse the gap between worlds, engaging in dynamic combat with many layered tactics, tremendous revelations and tragic tales to uncover. Dragon's Dogma. What a fantastic game. It is not perfect, far from it. I've voiced many flaws and issues I have with it, but for all its shortcomings, I've enjoyed myself on numerous playthroughs of this game, and will likely continue to do so as the years go by. Dragon's Dogma is my favorite action RPG, and I wish desperately that it would get a proper sequel to hopefully build and refine the mechanics it introduced, and hopefully do a better job at telling its compelling story. The Netflix produced anime is on the horizon, and its creation shows that there are indeed some people out there who believe that Dragon's Dogma has what it takes to still enthrall people with its world. I only hope that the release of the anime renews interest in the title, and that a sequel can be more publicly encouraged. If you have watched this entire video and maybe haven't played it yet, then, despite the story spoilers or perhaps armed with them to now understand a fuller picture of the narrative, I urge you, go and play Dragon's Dogma.
Yeah!